Hello, everyone, and very welcome to today's seminar to be held by Ewan Jones. Ewan Jones is university lecturer in 19th century literature at the Faculty of English, and he's also fellow and director of studies at Downing College, University of Cambridge. He completed his PhD at King's College, also at Cambridge University, and was previously a Fulbright scholar at New York University. He is the author of Coleridge and the Philosophy of Poetic Form, to appear at Cambridge University Press in 2014 and also in paperback 3 years later. He shows in this book that the essential elements of poetic expression, a poem's meter, rhythm, rhyme, and other such formal features influence ways of thinking in a distinctive manner. And a critical rediscovery of form, as it were, permits a rethinking of the relationship between verse and philosophy, so to speak, if I got that correctly. And Ewan has also written numerous articles on literary history, prosody, and digital humanities. Among them is the article "The Sonic Organization of Kubla Khan" that was published in Studies in Romanticism last year. He also recently, last year, published a piece in Thermodynamics. So he's widely published, and indeed his research interests embrace a wide but related field of interests: verse form, aesthetics, psychoanalysis, history and philosophy of science, computation, and digital culture. So did I forget anything?
No.
Right. We are very happy to have him here at SCAS, and very excited for this talk, which I believe will touch on a variety of different disciplines and areas in respective disciplines under the title on, well, not the title, but on rhythmical entrainment. So please, Ewan, welcome.
Thank you, Christina, for that introduction. Does everybody have a handout? Yeah, okay. I tend to pace around anxiously, but I've been told that I can't do that because I'm being filmed, so it'll look terrible if I'm continually coming back and forth. So I'm going to try and be disciplined, though it will be very difficult for me. One of the very few downsides to being in this amazing place is that you sometimes have the impression that you are repeating yourself to the colleagues that you eat lunch with and talk with every single day. So this preamble, some of you will have heard it before, and feel free to zone out for a moment or check your Twitter feed or whatever you want to do. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about the overall project that this talk comes from. So I'm trying to write a history of the concept of rhythm in the 19th century, and the argument I'm trying to prosecute is that that concept, such as we now understand it, comes into being over the 19th century. So from about 1770, people start using the word in a way that they just hadn't before. And a number of disciplines, I argue, feel a need to conceptualize rhythm in particular ways. So, I mean, that might seem like a strange claim to make, given that rhythm is a word that we use very often, except that that's not historically always been the case. This is just a Google Ngram, pretty crude, but it gives you a sense of the relative probability with which the word was used. So I've compared rhythm and meter here to give you some sense of just the historical invisibility of the term rhythm until there's a spike sort of towards the end of the 18th century, and then over the course of the 19th century, it increases extremely rapidly in comparison to meter, which we might think of as being a more delimited term, but which is actually used far more frequently than rhythm until quite late in the historical archive. And so that's the what of my argument, and the why of my argument, the why a bunch of disciplines established a nascent feel and need to conceptualize rhythm is they do so in part through an overlooked and in some ways surprising engagement with poetry. And I think that poetry can perform this role, not because it represents rhythm in a particular way, but because it actuates it, because it allows for certain rhythmical experiences to happen. It actuates rhythm in a particular way. And I'm interested in the process of concept formation, so that non-discursive experiential states that one might have when reading a poem on one's body, in one's mind, get conceptualized. What makes that possible? So that's the sort of broader philosophical stake of my project. I'm interested in concept formation more generally, and I'm also interested in terms of literary history in, and you might think about this usefully in terms of what Hazam was presenting last week when he was talking about wanting to move sociology away from this excessive preoccupation with why, the why narrative, to give a more thick and immediate description of certain moments in societies. In a sense, I'm coming at the problem from the opposite point of view, which is to say that in my field, literary criticism, we have lots of irreducible singularity. We have irreducible singularity in the form of the poems themselves, in terms of the experiences we might have of those poems, and I'm interested in trying to connect up those moments of irreducible singularity into some kind of narrative that doesn't travesty or betray what they are. Difficult job, I know. And that's why, in some ways, this is a methodologically hybrid work. Lots of this work is a kind of Begriffsgeschichte, conceptual history, familiar from Koselleck, but there are also, this is a warning for some of you, moments where I engage at length with the non-propositional aspects of poetry as well. So it's meter, it's rhythm, it's rhyme, those sorts of things, insofar as I believe that they are a kind of embodied cognition, and we need to find ways of accounting for how that embodied cognition might work to give a kind of historical concretion for it. So that's a very broad overview, and I'd be happy to talk about any of those aspects of the project afterwards. I'm going to present to you today from the third of 4 chapters in this book. So this is a moment later on in the 19th century where the word rhythm has already gotten established to some extent and is being taken up in a variety of established and nascent sciences and social sciences, hard sciences and social sciences. Okay. I want to start with a striking analogy that George Eliot makes in an essay of hers that's written in 1868 but not published until 1963, posthumously published under the title Notes on Form in Art. And this is number 1 quote on your handout. Eliot writes, "Poetic form was not begotten by thinking it out or framing it as a shell which should hold emotional expression any more than the shell of an animal arises before the living creature. But emotion, by its tendency to repetition, i.e. rhythmic persistence in proportion as diversifying thought is absent, creates a form by the recurrence of its elements in adjustment with certain given conditions of sound, language, action, or environment. Just as the beautiful expanding curves of a bivalve shell are not first made for the reception of the unstable inhabitant, but grow and are limited by the simple rhythmic conditions of its growing life." So bivalves, Eliot is thinking of mollusks, clams, those sorts of seafood delicacies, and she's not alone in her mollusk appreciation. There's a Victorian craze for the little things. Darwin talks about their beauty in The Origin of Species. Samuel Peckworth Woodward's A Manual of the Mollusca from 1851 is a good example of this Victorian craze for marine exploration. Eliot's partner, intellectual and romantic partner, George Henry Lewis, also writes Seaside Studies in 1860, which is all about these little specimens that he collected with Eliot herself in Ilfracombe. And Eliot's interest in these bivalves is representative also in the sense that she uses rhythm as a central category to think through the ways in which they are in the world, their interactions, their forms of movement, gestation, etc. Another very, let me just show you, there's a, this is a slide from Lewis's book actually, so from Seaside Studies, and this one here is a bivalve mollusk on the left-hand side. It's a clam-like bioluminescent mollusk, very beautiful, fetching specimen. You've got these gorgeous plates, so there's a real beauty to these things. Herbert Spencer, friend of Eliot and Lewis, is another good example of somebody who tries to use the humble mollusk or other humble organic entities as a way of understanding social process, social structure and social process. I'm not going to read this out to you, but quote number 2 on your handout is a good example of that. It's from Spencer's quite influential text, The Social Organism, where he likens, this is a familiar Victorian move, he likens societies and their developments to the developments of organic forms. And it might seem that he's going to move from the mollusks and the other simpler organisms to mammals and other more complex organisms, but in fact he doesn't do that at all. He's completely obsessed with polyps and mollusks and zoophytes and all these small things, and he comes to think actually that they are a better way even than mammals of understanding social structures. So where mammals have a very centralized nervous system, a sort of hierarchical top-down way of organizing it, Spencer is obsessed with the ways in which polyps and other forms have distributed nervous systems, so with quasi-autonomous regions or ganglia. He's interested in the fact that a lot of them are sort of have composite individuality, so it's very often difficult to tell whether these creatures are individual organisms or they're part of a group. They sort of swim together in this synchronized way. They generationally alternate between individuals and groups in all sorts of ways. And Spencer, all of these interests, the sort of distributed nervous system, composite individuality, rhythmical movement, all of these for Spencer are useful ways of thinking about society, and all of them involve the word rhythm for him in particular ways. He's one of the most important figures, I think, in defining and redefining rhythm at this particular moment in time. Now, in order to shed some light on this historical moment, I want to turn now to a term that in recent years has gotten a lot of currency particularly in ethnomusicology and biology, the idea of entrainment. And technical definition of entrainment is when an individual oscillator begins to synchronize its endogenous rhythms to an external phase or a period. By individual oscillator, I mean it could be a human entity like you and me, or it could be an organ that helps to make us up as entities. It could also be very, very small entities in the world. So Lewis was interested in mollusks and polyps, but cyanobacteria, tiny little forms, biologists study for their capacity to entrain, to organize their organic life in terms of some kind of cycle that's out there in the world, whatever that cycle might be. There are lots of studies at the moment in the tendency of individual brain waves to synchronize in particular ways. If this slide moves. Oops, sorry, hold on a moment. There's a recent study, amazing study, which shows how parents that read nursery rhymes to their children, if they read them whilst making eye contact, and if they have a particular metrical structure, these nursery rhymes, their brain waves will entrain, but both of those conditions need to be met. It's also a phenomenon that occurs very often in non-Western music, which is not notated according to sort of fixed time signatures, but very often has a more porous relationship to the environment in a particular way. So it's a very interesting concept that's being used at the moment, and I think it's a useful way of understanding the 19th century, but the process goes both ways. That's to say, entrainment helps us to understand and clarify some of the debates going on in the 19th century, but some of the 19th century texts that I'm going to be looking at also cast a critical light, help us to rethink some of the moral or the philosophical questions around entrainment. We can do a little history of entrainment if you want. There's a moment, this is often dated as sort of the first moment, the first demonstration of entrainment in 16 65, when the Dutch horologist Christian Huygens is trying to measure the longitude coordinate at sea, and he's ill, unfortunately, so he's lying in his bed. He's got all these clocks and pendulums around, and he starts to see this weird thing happening with these two pendulums, which start. They start out of phase, and gradually they begin to synchronize to one another. I'm going to try and show you a video now. So this is where the technology shows. I love this. This is a YouTube clip that shows this phenomenon. He called it, in a letter to the Royal Society, he called it odd sympathy. This tendency for these two pendulums to synchronize. This is a drawing he made of it. Let's see. Okay, and I love the way in this video you've got this kind of very excitable American voiceover talking about the cosmic properties of this synchronization. So hopefully there'll be some sound and you can hear that. Okay, let's try and.
Took some experimentation, but a thin piece of brass for the shelf, 2 marker caps as rollers, and some plastic tracks on the brackets did the trick. And as we watch the metronome slowly come into synchrony, I think it's difficult not to feel a twinge of surprise at a phenomenon that refuses to be as obvious as perhaps we assumed it should. And insofar as it excites within us even a modest amount of amazement, this simple apparatus induces a sympathy between ourselves and those individuals who first struggled to understand its meaning. It induces a sympathy between our present age and an age where the mechanical and the miraculous existed side by side. Neither stands convincing enough to displace the other. Indeed, a pendulum clock is just as useless as the powder of sympathy when trying to find the longitude at sea. And the synchrony of clocks is itself a coupling between two worlds, a world of occult powers and virtues which act over a distance, and a mechanistic world which flatly denied that action at a distance was possible. Huygens was correct that this particular phenomenon is mechanical. But it's one of the great ironies of history that Isaac Newton, in his attempts to build upon the mechanical philosophy, ended up revealing that the entire structure...
Shut them up there. And you may have noticed that towards the end, so they were synchronizing and they were then falling out of phase again. This is what happens. So the reason why it happens is that the pendulums have to be placed on a particular kind of surface. So Huygens had put them on this wood, which allowed the communication of enough energy to create a negative feedback loop. So it depends on what they're placed on in order for it to work. Okay, so there's a good distinction, a technical distinction that is made by 3 scholars, Brown, Merker, and Wallin, in a very useful summary of entrainment, which is number 3 on your handout, because I'll read this first. Number 3. So they say resonance, for example, is not to be considered entrainment. If a tuning fork producing sound waves in a resonance box is removed, the oscillations in the box also cease. This is an important point because it alerts us to the possibility that the mere observation of synchronized behavior or synchronous variation in 2 variables does not necessarily imply entrainment. So they're making a distinction between Huygens's odd sympathy and what's often known as sympathetic resonance, which is a musical phenomenon that's been known to the world for a very long time, where if you play a particular string on a guitar at the right frequency, another string will vibrate even though it hasn't been directly played. And this sympathetic resonance underpinned a huge number of philosophies, cosmologies. Plotinus is very interested in this kind of phenomenon, and it's a way of thinking about human beings as part of an orderly, harmonious, balanced universe where the human subject is often figured as a stringed instrument, a lute or of some sort, an Aeolian harp or a lute that's sometimes played, animated by the breeze of God, for example. I think that so how do I move this on? Sorry, I'm just going to have to come out of this too. Never try and embed videos in PowerPoint. Oops. Okay. So this is a good this is a good example of, this is an Aeolian Harp. There's a little nice poem by Coleridge that gives you an example of this. What if animated nature be but organic hearts diverting for the tremble into thought as over them sweeps plastic and vast, one intellectual breeze that wants the soul of each and God of all. Okay, so I'm interested in this distinction between sympathetic resonance and Huygens' odd sympathy, between harmony and rhythm in this case, because I think they imply a fundamentally different ways of understanding the manner in which different entities come into relationship with one another. So to try and formalize this just a little bit, I'm going to give you a couple of distinctions. Oops, sorry. So first of all, resonance, harmonious resonance, implies sort of unilateral causality. A causes B. Entrainment A and B both possess an endogenous rhythm that comes into contact with one another that produces a new rhythm that's irreducible to both. So, as they say, the tuning fork, you stop the stimulus, the other thing stops. With entrainment, there's a more dynamic relationship between the two of them. And then another important distinction for me, harmonious resonance is quite static. Two chords stand for a broader cosmology, perfectly fitted and unchanging. Entrainment is by contrast dynamic. So, a sort of Neoplatonic cosmology, the order is there, it doesn't change. Whereas in entrainment, the moment of synchronization is a moment. It comes into being and it falls out of being. So it's a more dynamic idea. Now, this might seem a narrowly technical separation between these two entities, but I'm making it because I think it's a useful way of understanding a whole variety of historical materials that don't have the word entrainment to hand, but that nonetheless conceptualize it avant la lettre. So I don't have time to really race through these examples. There are many I could tell you about afterwards. But a good example of this, I think, is Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, where throughout this text he actually makes a series of distinctions between percussive instruments, beating time, and stringed instruments being harmoniously attuned to things. Number 4 is a good example of that. He's talking about the suffering individual who longs for that relief which nothing can afford him but the entire concord of the affections of the spectators with his own. To see the emotions of their hearts in every respect beat time to his own in the violent and disagreeable passions constitutes his sole consolation. But he can only hope to obtain this by lowering his passion to that pitch in which the spectators are capable of going along with him. He must flatten, if I may be allowed to say so, the sharpness of its natural tone in order to reduce it to harmony and concord with the emotions of those who are about him. So we see the transformation of a rhythmical, metaphorical understanding of human beings beating time into a harmonious one, which is the process of flattening out what would otherwise be a dangerously contagious emotion into something that is proper and balanced in a particular way. And Smith, throughout this text, the theory of moral sentiments is well known, is sort of terrified of these moments of embodied contagion, where you're walking down the street and you see a beggar, and if you're a person of nervous disposition, or a woman for Smith, you might sympathise involuntarily. You would start to feel pains in your stomach, which he thinks is a bad thing. Okay. So the understanding of rhythmical entrainment or rhythmical organisation as something that operates within the organism, that which is becoming widespread in the 19th century, I think creates a source of anxiety for a number of thinkers over that time frame. So there are lots of examples of that, where there is a profound anxiety about the involuntary or contagious nature of embodied sympathy. Again, I could give you loads of examples of that. I'm just going to focus on one. That's the prize that you get if you sit through this. It's a horse dancing to disco music, so don't go away. Dancing, I mean, there's up for debate, so... Shall I just go straight to the horse? Okay, it's this bloody thing. This is a famous illustration from Dickens's serial publication of A Tale of Two Cities, Fizz's illustration. So it's about the French Revolution. This is a moment of mob violence where they're all dancing the Carmagnole, getting carried away, chopping people's heads off. It's, I think, a significant illustration insofar as it shows very clearly the identity that's being the identity between musical, percussive entrainment and a kind of uncontrollable sympathy here. So you can see there's the elderly woman in the sort of on the right hand side who's got a bloodied cleaver in one hand and a drum mallet in the other. So the equivalence is made absolutely plain. And I think that literature engages entrainment, this idea of entrainment, in very specific ways. Again, asking this question as to what is the human if humans are in some ways involuntarily embodied entities. So I have to read this quote in its entirety to really give you the full sense of it. It's quote number 5 on your handout, where Dickens gives, as it were, the prose, rhythmical equivalent to this visual illustration here. And it's really describing the same scene. So it's number 5 on your handout. As these ruffians turned and turned, their matted locks now flung forward over their eyes, now flung backward over their necks, some women held wine to their mouths that they might drink, and what with dripping blood, and what with dripping wine, and what with the stream of sparks struck out of the stone, all their wicked atmosphere seemed gore and fire. The eye could not detect one creature in the group free from the smear of blood. Shouldering one another to get next at the sharpening stone were men stripped to the waist, with the stain all over their limbs and bodies, men in all sorts of rags, with the silk and ribbon, with the stain dyeing those trifles through and through. Hatchets, knives, bayonets, swords, all brought to be sharpened, were all red with it. Some of the hacked swords were tied to the wrists of those who carried them, with strips of linen and fragments of dress, ligatures various in kind, but all deep of the one colour. And as the frantic wielders of these weapons snatched them from the stream of sparks and tore away into the streets, the same red hue was red in their frenzied eyes, eyes which any unbrutalized beholder would have given 20 years of life to petrify with a well-directed gun. This is not one of Dickens's better novels, partly because of the reactionary disapproval of the French Revolution. It's a very conservative piece, it's a very objectifying piece of the French, partly because the flatness of his characterization here is unleavened even with the kind of comedic burlesque elements. But I think the very flatness of characterization makes this in many ways a more interesting piece of writing. The flatness of the characterization shows us more than a whole parlour room full of depth studies of individuated essences can, because Dickens shows us the ways in which people's bodies entrain compulsively to one another. Whole series of ways this happens with the text. But I'm particularly interested in this extract here as to the way in which the accelerating rhythmical sentences of Dickens's prose entrain not only us as we read through this piece, but entrain the narrator as well, who recoils from his disgust at revolutionary violence and excess into exactly the sort of thing he was recoiling from. That's to say, this very weird bit right at the end, eyes which any unbrutalized beholder would have given 20 years of life to petrify. It hides behind a pseudo-rationalized legal sentence, 20 years of life, which makes no sense, and might, if we're reading the novel carefully enough, remind us of the almost exactly 20 years of life that Dr. Manette has been spending in the Bastille incarcerated earlier, where he's nervously pacing around making shoes for himself. So embodied experience, contagious embodied experience, lives through Dickens's prose style here. But this poses an obvious problem for ethics if we can't understand sympathy without involuntary contagion and embodiment, but that if it leads to such kinds of involuntary action, what might an ethics of entrainment look like? What might sympathy look like? What might sympathetic entrainment be? And there's one way of answering that, or answering that question. I want to turn for the remainder of this talk to poetry specifically, and double back to the George Eliot with whom the talk began. I don't think that in the first quote, when she mentions poetic form, she means poetry in a loose or metaphorical or vague way. Eliot is obsessed with specifically poetic form at this time in her life, as her letters and her diaries show. And I think that she is interested in poetry for two major reasons, because she feels that it can give her something with regard to rhythmical entrainment that prose cannot. The first of these things is a formal hybridity, which is to say that at least at this moment in the 19th century, poetry is able to bring together different modes within itself, ballads, sestinas, blank verse, what have you, in ways that prose at this period cannot. And the second, coupled fact, is that this formal hybridity is sedimented with historicity. All of these modes in poetry have a shelf life, extend back in time far beyond prose. So a mode such as ballad has a deep antecedence, which means that when we use it, we're not just making use of its intrinsic expressive resources, we are also in some way inhabiting its accumulated historical conventions and possibilities. And I say that these two things are important for Eliot because at the moment that she's writing Notes on Form in Art, she's also writing by far her most ambitious poem, The Spanish Gypsy, published in 1868 after years of diligent research. It's not a work that tends to be read very often, largely because Eliot, of course, is for us primarily a prose stylist. But I think it's a very interesting, if imperfect and uneven, work. And I'm going to spend the rest of this talk really telling you a little bit about it. And I'm going to summarise the plot very briefly in a second, but it doesn't really matter. You don't need to know the plot because I'm more interested in the ways in which the individual moments that I'm going to read out to you in a moment entrain you. So it's set in 15th century Andalusia, in Granada. Eliot's fascinated by the denominational complexity of them, the fact that you've got Muslims and Christians and Jews and what she calls gypsies, or Zincali, she calls them, at the time. And it's about a woman called Fidalma who is engaged to a Spanish nobleman, but discovers by chance that in fact her father is the leader of this renegade band of Zincali, gypsies in Eliot's term. And discovering this, she abandons her Spanish heritage to go release the Zincali, go and live with them, suffer with them. They declare war on exactly her compatriots that she had, her former compatriots. Her lover joins her as well, Don Silva. The two, even though he has no attachment to this community, but he rebels when he sees the Zincali killing a Spanish priest that used to be his priest. Her lover, her husband at this point, then kills the father. Tragic predicament, and the verse tragedy ends with them renouncing one another, gazing into one another's eyes and renouncing one another. So you can probably tell by my super accelerated plot summary that the plot is not really where the interest is here. It's a pretty unoriginal and definitely unconvincing idea storyline, interesting one but unconvincing one. I'm more interested in the way in which Eliot is using verse in a particular way, not just to represent but also to actuate entrainment. And so I'm going to read a couple of examples from that. The first of which is number 6 on your handout, and this is the pivotal moment at the start of the work when Fidalma starts to dance spontaneously on the plaza, overcome by this music that she hears, which is a kind of premonition of her Zincali ancestry in some ways. So, number 6. The long notes linger on the trembling air, with subtle penetration enter all the myriad corridors of the passionate soul. Message-like spread and answering action rouse, not angular jigs that warm the chilly limbs in hoary northern mists, but action curved to soft andante strains pitch plaintively, vibrations sympathetic stir all limbs. Old men live backward in their dancing prime and move in memory. Small legs and arms with pleasant agitation purposeless go up and down like pretty fruits in gales. All long in common for the expressive act, yet wait for it, as in the olden time men waited for the bard to tell their thought. So a kind of beautifully distilled example of sympathetic vibration as Eliot sees it here, which manipulates verse in all manner of ways I don't have time to enumerate now. Notice the way in which Eliot's manipulating enjambment here in the blank verse line to, as it were, set up expectation of music, of rhythmical stimulus, and then check it, qualify it, right at the end there of that extract. All long in common for the expressive act, yet wait for it, the way in which you use the line break as a form of qualification. And it's clear that this community is in some way in training to Fidelma's rhythms, and she is in training to the music that she hears. Okay, so that's one example of the way in which Eliot is actuating these things. And the verse tragedy gets a little more complex from this point on. Eliot's fascinated by the way in which, as I say, you've got this denominational tapestry, rich tapestry in 15th century Andalusia at this period in time, and the formal counterpart to this are these different modes, different poetic modes that Eliot uses, deploys. So she writes not just blank verse that you've heard here, but also ballad, other forms as well, which are, as it were, have a relationship to orality, the body, those sorts of things. And she's sort of putting them together in a way to test the limits of liberal pluralism, the extent to which you can incorporate these different modes without society falling apart. Number 7 is a good example of that, I think. So you've got the end of a ballad, a trochaic ballad, which then goes on to another moment of entrainment. Day is dying, float, O swan, down the ruby river, follow song in requiem to the mighty giver. The exquisite hour, the ardour of the crowd, the strains more plenteous, and the gathering might of action passionate where no effort is, but self's poor gates open to rushing power that blends the inward ebb and outward vast. All gathering influences culminate and urge Fidelma. Earth and heaven seem one, life a glad trembling on the outer edge of unknown rapture. Swifter now she moves, filling the measure with a double beat and widening circle. Now she seems to glow with more declared presence, glorified. Circling she lightly bends and lifts on high the multitudinous sounding tambourine, and makes it ring and boom, then lifts it higher, stretching her left arm beauteous. Now the crowd exultant shouts, forgetting poverty in the rich moment of possessing her. Just to show you very briefly, Eliot's relying on, to a great extent, on this book that's published by a guy called George Borrow. There's a real vogue also in the 19th century for gypsy law, as it's then called. This is an example, horrible example really, horribly objectifying example, where a Zincali woman who's overcome by dancing starts to throw her infant into the air, in a not very good example of parenting. And Eliot had a copy of this book and used it for a lot of anthropological, not this, but she used it for as a source of anthropological insight. But I'm interested in the way in which the remainder of this poem breaks with this fetishizing tendency. So Borrow, on the one hand, this is a sort of disgustingly objectifying thing, but he also, like many people at the time, fetishizes the Zincali, fetishizes the gypsies, quote unquote, by seeing them as having a primitive rhythm from which modern man, industrializing modern man, has gotten estranged. Eliot doesn't give into either of those tendencies. She doesn't racialize and objectify, but neither does she fetishize in some particular way. Fidelma at the start of this verse tragedy might seem to be rather like this, in that she gets lost in the dance, and that in some ways stands for her belonging to the Zincali community. But when she actually leaves her Spanish community for the Zincali, it never quite works out for her. She can never quite entrain fully to it because she cannot forget the history of her past. There's a moment, this is quote number 8 on your handout, where her father tells her just to do this in a way that, again, notice the difference between the harmonious and the rhythmical here. He says, "'Tis a vile life that has no ear, save for the tickling lute set to small measures, deaf to all the beats of that large music rolling o'er the world," when he's trying to convince her to give herself fully to this cause that she cannot do, because she cannot forget her lover, and she cannot quite entirely forget the history from which she has issued. Okay, and that's one reason why you have this catastrophe, why actually the project, the Zincali project, can never work, why the war happens, why it ends with her father being slain. And at this point in the verse tragedy, the different modes, the different formal modes that had been seamlessly interwoven, so that Eliot moved from ballad to blank verse and back again, have become sundered. The songs are oppositional to an increasing prose that's come into the narrative. There is much more interruption, much more stylistic incongruity, and a collision rather than a seamless relationship of formal modes. So taking all of this into account, it doesn't really seem like Eliot's Spanish Gypsy has given us much more than Dickens's Tale of Two Cities. We again see the ways in which human beings entrain in ultimately negative ways, and the ways in which there's a difficulty to reconcile the embodied beings that we are with the historical beings that we are as well. We might have an essential impulse that catapults us into certain actions, but that stands at odds with the history of the people that we have come from and the people that we've loved and those kinds of things. It seems like it's a dilemma. And Eliot did indeed see her work as a tragedy. She referred to it in this way as a tragedy, except it doesn't quite finish as a tragedy. It finishes, as I said a moment ago, with this strange sort of ambiguous scene between the two lovers who are taking leave of one another but not doing a very good job of taking leave of one another in the way that lovers sometimes don't do very good jobs of that. And again, I'm interested in this final closing moment in the poem because I think it actuates entrainment in a particular way for us, where it creates a room for both our embodiment as subjects reading this work, but also as subjects that have a history, in this case the history of the poem, that we have internalized to some extent. I'll show you what I mean by reading the quote number 9 on your handout. My lord, farewell. He did not say farewell, but neither knew that he was silent. She, for one long moment, moved not. They knew naught save that they parted, for their mutual gaze, as with their souls' full speech, forbade their hands to seek each other, those oft-clasping hands which had a memory of their own and went widowed of one dear touch forevermore. Alas, she turned and with swift movement went, beckoning to Hinder, who was bending low and hungered still to wash her shells, but soon leaping and scampering followed, while her queen mounted the steps again and took her place, which Juan rendered silently. This is a moment of false leave-taking. They never really say goodbye. It lasts for an extremely long time. And I'm particularly interested here in the ways in which Eliot, even though this is blank verse, so it's an unrhyming metrical form, has these kind of crypto-rhymes or mono-rhymes at the end of sentences. Farewell, farewell. You notice hands, hands in successive words. And there's a way, successive lines, there's a way in which the hands wonderfully actuate the sort of prehensile groping that we have for the next line, the next enjambment line, for the lover that is out there somewhere. But it's not just that they do that. It's not just that this verse powerfully entrains us through the way in which these important words that come at the end of the lines make us stop and go forward at the same time. It also, these end of line rhymes, go back to the poem as a whole. They are things that have occurred frequently in the poem. As we therefore inhabit the bodies of the subjects here, we're also actuating the historicity of this poem, our experiences of this poem. And I think this is one way that Eliot wants to find a way, despite the tragic overtones of a piece, of reconciling those two elements, reconciling embodiment and historicity in a way that might produce an ethics for entrainment. And the reason why I feel this is important to her, just to turn finally back to Notes on Form and Art, is a specification that she makes for poetry. It might seem that when she says poets are like bivalve mollusks, that it's an entirely levelling, reductionist materialism. A bit like when Daniel Dennett says human beings tell stories in the way that spiders spin webs. Thoroughgoing, levelling materialism. But that's not quite what Eliot says, because at the end of this essay, she swerves in a slightly different direction. It's the final quote in your handout, number 10. She says, "A form being once started must by and by cease to be purely spontaneous. The form itself becomes the object and material of emotion and is sought after, amplified and elaborated by discrimination of its elements, till at last, by the abuse of its refinement, it preoccupies the room of emotional thinking. And poetry, from from being the fullest expression of the human soul is starved into an ingenious pattern work in which tricks with vocables take the place of living words fed with the blood of relevant meaning and made musical by the continual intercommunication of sensibility and thought. Entrainment showed the difficulty of the porosity between humans and non-human animals in terms of the involuntary responses that we have to external stimuli. Eliot here finds a kind of humanism, but not as we know it, a deflationary humanism that finds some human singularity not through a magical capacity for aesthetic appreciation or sympathy or any of those things, but from the simple fact that the homes we fashion for ourselves naturally have a tendency periodically to cease to provide us shelter, to fall down. I think it's in this respect that poetry, by bringing together its accumulated intrinsic resources and its accumulated historic conventions, can offer us a way of thinking about social rhythms that understands their compulsive entraining force whilst nonetheless taking into account rupture, individuation, and variation. It's a way of thinking a composite social rhythm. Thank you.